Hi, I'm Professor Beck Strah.
And I'm Professor Eric Bronson, and you're listening to Prison Breakdown.
2, 3, break!
Hate to spoil his fun, but we're gonna bust out of here.
2, 3, break!
I'm locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me.
2, 3, break!
I can honestly say I'm a changed man. No danger to society here. God's honest truth.
2, 3, break!
I'm not leaving this cell. I'll get out my way. The right way.
2, 3, break!
Ahoy, dudes, and welcome back to Prison Breakdown. Ahoy, Eric.
Ahoy. What? Great. How are you?
I am outstanding, my friend. Producer Britt, how we doing?
Spectacular.
Eric, hit us with the weather.
It is simply a gorgeous day. This is the type of weather that makes it this is the reason why you live in New England for this type of day. It is simply gorgeous out there. Sunny, nice and clear skies. The water looks gorgeous, and nearly 70 degrees. It's kind of perfect, especially if you're a large land mammal like myself.
For those of you listening to this episode, I want you to, especially if you live in Rhode Island, I want you to reflect and think back to what the weather was like 2 weeks ago, and that's what we're talking about now.
Right. I mean, just go back a couple days when it was pouring down rain. We got another 3 inches, 2.5 inches of rain. It was it's great out right now.
Perfection.
The students were begging to get out of class. Yeah.
and I assume dictator Bronson, he wouldn't budge, would he?
Oh, hell no. Sit your asses down and learn. This is research methods.
I find students
we're talking about
often,
content analysis in here.
Oh, I love content analysis. I find students are often most afraid of research methods. But besides stats, research methods is one that, if it was not required, I don't know if most students would take it. But I think it is also one of the most important classes.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, first off, it's hard for most people to make it entertaining or interesting. But there are plenty of studies out there that you can draw from that are fun and will keep the students' attention. I mean, I love that Middle Miss study about interpersonal relationships at the urinal.
You and me both, brother. After you recommended it, I teach it every semester. I have students read this article and break it down, and they find that what's the word that they use in micturation or something like that.
Yeah, that's such a great piece. I love it.
I think students learn a lot about how people experience some physiological effects and reflecting maybe anxiety when somebody stands next to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or is just in the room with them at all, even if they're not right next to them, it still impacts them.
Yeah, and there's
longer onset and shorter duration.
You remember it well.
Yeah, exactly. I could have seen some of my professors that I had telling me, "Hey, go sit in that toilet stall and listen to urine, the onset of urine, and measure how long it lasts. Onset and duration. That's what we're worried about.
To be the person in a stall with a stopwatch trying to keep track of how long somebody's peeing for research, wouldn't that be the best job?
Yeah, right.
I mean, besides the smells and sounds and
having in a restroom for hours.
Right. Yeah. Because that was back in the day when they used to exploit the hell out of grad students, right?
Not that they don't anymore, but yes.
Yeah.
You're
pulling your 12-hour shift. Yeah, you're doing your 12-hour shift in the urinal today. Let's go.
I think there's opportunities that could knock down the line for us to recreate Middle Miss study. That's sociology. You love sociology.
Yeah. Love it. And nothing better. Nothing better. And also just putting people in awkward situations to see how they react. So let's break down those stall doors around the urinals and get up nice and close and personal with those that are using them and see what happens.
Break down those stall doors, Eric says. I love like social psychology research where like I had a social psych class in college where we had to do something that was breaking a social norm. So when you get on an elevator, you have to turn around and stare at the person behind you, or you get too close to somebody in line at a grocery store. I love stuff like that. That is so interesting to read about for me.
Yeah. It's great. I mention it to students. You remember, it's a fun one in class. I don't assign seats, but by the third class, the students have found their seats for the semester, right?
Yeah.
And they self-select. I tell them at the third week of class, hey, if you want to mess with somebody, just sit in their quote unquote their seat during a class, and just see what I said. They won't learn a damn thing because they'll be so infuriated that you took their seat during that one class period because we take ownership of something that isn't ours. It's a great little experiment, and all of our students who are conformists are like, no, I can't do that to someone.
Yes, exactly. People have a sense of ownership of said seat,
right?
I think.
There's a great study that sociologists did a few years ago on people taking ownership of parking spots. I don't know if you heard about that one. They stood on top of a mall and watched a parking lot during the holidays. If there was somebody, people, what they do is they time them when they get to their car, when they'd open the car door until the time they pulled out of their spot. On average, it was like right around 47 seconds. So they'd get into the car, they'd start it up, and they'd drive off. If there was somebody waiting for their spot, they would punish them, and it would take like a minute. It would be like 1 minute and 30 seconds. So they'd punish them. Wow. There was a penalty for waiting for their spot. So they were owning the spot longer and making the person wait for it.
That is crazy.
It's great stuff. But
the things we do to each other.
We're so mean to each other.
Yes, that's horrendous. Yeah. But that is a fascinating study. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's just made the podcast that much better.
Absolutely.
You know what else would make the podcast better right now?
How about some news hot off the razor wire?
Hot dog.
Fresh news, hot off the razor wire.
All right, here's a fun headline for you. Nearly half of U.S. prisons draw water likely contaminated with toxic PFAS water or chemicals, and these are what are known as the forever chemicals. So if we think about that 1 million approximately, that's nearly half of all inmates in the United States. So it's at least 1 million people incarcerated in the United States, including 13,000 juveniles, are estimated to be housed in prisons, and they are especially vulnerable to the dangerous chemicals because there is little they can do to protect themselves.
Chris,
so they're finding that
all these
elaborate US though, prisons.
Not all these prisons are drawing from the same reservoir.
Says,
so how is it affecting all these?
No, they're not coming from the same places. But it says nearly half of them draw water from sources likely contaminated with these forever chemicals. This research finds out of UCLA. And so we need to think about who is exposed and who has the least agency to mitigate their exposure. That's why this is such a unique population. We see the dehumanization of incarcerated people across the country, and these exposures are symptoms of a larger problem, said Nicholas Shapiro, the study's co-author from UCLA.
That's interesting. And I may have mentioned this in the last episode or maybe the one before that, but it also speaks to why we need some democratization of prisons, where it actually was found in a Massachusetts prison, MCI Norfolk, where there was an issue with the water. It was too high in some mineral that I believe was linked with Alzheimer's or linked with Parkinson's, something. There's some sort of some sort of effect that is pretty nasty. And there was a water study. Inmates pushed back, and they actually had this inmate council to represent them and push their findings on this to up chain and DOC and to the governor and to the press. Inmates need representation like that. That's super important. And a study like this telling us that like half of the inmates, more than half of the inmates, it's like 1.8, 1.9 million people who are incarcerated in the US. So 1 million people are exposed to dangerous chemicals. Like they need a voice. They need representation. Do something about it.
And so the article goes on that PFAS, forever chemicals, are a class of about 15,000 chemicals often used to make products resistant to water, stains, and heat. They are called forever chemicals because they do not naturally break down and are linked to cancer, liver problems, thyroid issues, birth defects, kidney disease, decreased immunity, and other serious health problems. And like you said, who's going to speak up for them? Who's going to be the ones who say, hey, this is something that's a major issue for all individuals? So a good example of this is they highlighted a women's prison near Tampa that draws from groundwater highly contaminated with the PFAS-laden firefighting foam from a nearby firefighting school. Foam is one of the largest sources of PFAS water pollution in the United States.
Wow. Do you think foam parties are a big contributor to these?
Boy, that would be something to find out, because that's going to change the way we do graduation this year. Oh. Wow. I would think so. Like all foam kind of, if it's for that. Well, this is foam for putting out fire, right? So that might be completely different. Those have got some really harsh chemicals in them.
Yeah, I'm sure. The foam that we see at a foam party, is that just bubbles?
I would assume so.
It's just like you're taking like bubble
I would hope so.
And dumping it into a water supply coming out foamy.
Yeah, you think so?
Now, Eric, tell me, have you ever been to a foam party? What's your understanding of a foam party, my friend?
No, I've never been to one. I don't have much other than what I've seen images of on social media, probably. Oh. So what are your experiences there with foam parties?
I went to one back at the beginning of college, and I actually met a woman there who was to become an ex-girlfriend of mine later on down the line. So I guess was to become a girlfriend, then an ex-girlfriend. But we dated for a couple of years. She recognized me off of MySpace. She said, "Hey, Becker," because my name on MySpace was Becker at the time, of course, as my nickname, and it was reflected on my beautiful Alaska license plate that said Becker. And so she said, "Hey, Becker," and we struck up a conversation. Our eyes met. We fell in love, etc. And it was not to be, but respect to her. Hope you're doing well out there, Caroline.
So was that your nickname during college? Was Becker?
High school and college. That is correct. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It's a good nickname. The show Becker was hot on the air around there.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was pulling off that show Becker, huh? And it, obviously plays with your name. So I don't know. That's interesting, though.
Yeah, it could have been a better show. I
that's what they need. Well, I'm just going to have the students make sure they're calling you Professor Becker.
Yes. There's something about it that rubs me the wrong way when somebody calls me Professor Beck. I don't know what it is. I don't. Really? Something about me. I don't call them on it most of the time, but it rubs me the wrong way. Do you ever get that? Hello, Professor Eric.
No. Everybody just calls me Bronson.
Yeah. Maybe I need to establish myself.
And that's the way it's been my entire life. Yeah. It's just Strah.
I need that. I want that.
I think Bronson is I think Bronson is, because of Charles Bronson, the whole death wish. I think that's why it's so common for me to end up just being Bronson
Also,
all the
the
time.
movie Bronson starring Tom Hardy.
Yeah.
Great prison film.
Yeah, that was.
Yes. We're developing
Yeah, it was.
a series for next month, Movie Main It. Yes, it's going to be us in discussion of prison movies. That would be an interesting one that we should
Yes.
maybe consider as well. Bronson.
We should. And Bronson.
Yes.
Yeah, we could just call it Bronson
Yes,
on Bronson.
let's do it.
And then only you can talk about Bronson.
I don't have that level of privilege. Bronson on Bronson. All right. Any other thoughts on dangerous chemicals?
That is the news for this week.
All right. We hope that there's some action being taken on this. In the article, does it mention anything about that?
No, it really doesn't. It talks about the exact same thing that we were mentioning, that there's very few people advocating for inmates and making sure that they have access to clean water or anything else, because our society is really, let's dump them. We lock them up, throw away the key, and we don't care what's going on. So, yeah.
Oof. Yes. All right. We need more advocacy for people. Yep. If you're an attorney dealing with human rights, listening to this podcast for some reason, maybe give this a look. These people need an adequate representation. Shall we move on to the topic for the day? All right.
Sir.
The topic of the day is solitary confinement. It's an interesting one to people. Solitary confinement, also referred to as special housing, the SHU for special housing unit, supermax custody. Eric, give me some other names that we use to discuss it.
The whole.
Thank you. The favorite of all, the whole.
The whole. The whole. Send them to the hole.
So it's problematic in several ways that we'll get into, but I want to start out with mentioning the racial disparities that we see here. And if we look at persons in solitary confinement, more than 4/5 of persons in solitary confinement are either Black or Latinx. And an article out of UC Irvine quoted, Black and white offenders were equally likely to commit prison rule infractions. However, Black inmates were more likely to be written up for rule infractions. So we have seen some disparities in who actually gets written up and who is handled more informally, just across race. Now, we know that solitary confinement is more expensive. Eric, why is it more expensive to have a solitary confinement unit? And why is it more expensive to staff and run than other areas?
So with the solitary confinement units, it starts off with just what the word infers. These individuals will be housed in individual cells. So the unit needs to be a little bit larger and house less inmates. So we're talking about inmate to cell space. And then next, you have to have higher levels of staff in these institutions because when individuals are locked up in solitary confinement, generally they are spending 23 or 24 hours a day in their cells, which means things need to be delivered to the inmates. Yeah. And so you have to have staff either taking the food or whatever their needs are to the inmate, or have a inmate that's a cadre inmate, or has some type of meritorious type of housing or standing, and they deliver it with the staff there with them. So it just requires a higher inmate to staff ratio.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to have it's something like inmates in solitary confinement usually have to be escorted by multiple officers if they're ever going to leave their cells, if they're going out to rec, or they're going to a doctor's appointment, something like that. in my experience, we would have to have at least 2 corrections officers on hand. We would have to put the person in leg irons. We would have to handcuff them behind their back and escort them wherever they're going. 2 officers with the inmate at any time. Some of the more dangerous inmates, maybe more staffing than that. No, I'll get to that later. But it's a problem. Solitary confinement entails keeping someone in a cell typically for 23 to 24 hours a day. And if they get some recreation time, it's typically in a small area. Any kind of outdoor rec, I've seen in some documentaries where inmates get to go outside and they are literally kept in a cage about the size of their cell. They just get some sunlight. And often they will even be handcuffed inside that cage, which is also crazy. So what else can I say about it? As far as jobs, they're not able to really work very much. Sometimes they can like package silverware or do some kind of menial work, but it's not a lot. Classes are pretty limited in terms of what they can do. Sometimes they'll have a TV in their cell where they can receive some kind of programming from that. But to Eric's point, the correction officer to prisoner ratio is about 3 times higher than we would see in general population. We also see a lot higher costs around construction because in general population, people are housed 2 to a cell, sometimes more if we are looking at like a dormitory unit. But it's about 3 times the cost of what an inmate would cost in general population because we have to have 1 person per cell. We have to have a lot higher staffing levels for the safety of inmates and staff both. And the costs are crazy. So Mississippi, a couple of years ago, closed a solitary confinement unit, and they ended up saving about $8 million a year. Illinois closed a Supermax unit a few years ago, and they saved about $26 million a year. And so think about all the money that could go back to programming and treatment to actually help rehabilitate inmates if we were to start closing solitary units or figuring out some better way to handle this. What do you think?
First of all, going back to one of the points you said, when they're locked up in solitary confinement, their access to programs, rehabilitation services, is dramatically reduced. So let's take inmates who go to some type of let's say it's cognitive behavioral therapy or some type of group therapy where they are working together. And, we want individuals to gain some skills while they're locked up in, interpersonal relationships, working with others, talking with others, dealing with other individuals. Well, the way to do that is actually interact with people and have them think about what they would do in the future when, their big red button is pushed by somebody in society. Well, if they're just sitting in their cell, because they're in solitary confinement, they can't go to these group settings. They don't have access to those types of therapy sessions. So what happens is the counselor or therapist or psychologist, whoever works at whatever they have at that institution, then has to go and stand outside their door, and they do therapy through the door. And what the hell? I mean, throw confidentiality right out the window, right? What inmate is going to talk to a therapist right outside their cell door and be open and honest when Jim Bob is in the cell next to you and can hear everything you're saying? So, that's one of the biggest first things is for individuals to be able to work on themselves. It becomes extremely difficult inside those institutions while they're locked up. Also, as you mentioned, the loss of access to recreation or working out, which we know from experience and research that inmates who are able to go over to the weight pile or to the gym can go and work off that anger or rage that they might have been feeling from a certain phone call or a letter or an interaction with a staff member. And that then helps bring them back down so that they're not in a rage to kill somebody or assault someone or whatever it might be. Those things help. And if you're going from your 7 by 9 foot cell to a 12 foot by 12 foot by 12 foot cage, which is what, the prisons I've been to that are, you're mentioning, supermax prisons or maximum security prisons where they have these isolation units and they take them to a recreation cage, and that's exactly what it is. It's fenced in, it's inside the walls, and it's they've got 12 foot by 12 foot, and the ceiling is 12 foot high. And that's where they get their recreation in. So I mean, the inmates who have been there for a while will get in there and try and work out, but we know that not all inmates get access to it, or it might be just once a week or twice a week. They don't get out of their cell every single day when they're in these situations. And I think if Americans knew how many inmates we had locked up in these places where they're there long term, and anything over a few days, I think begins to wear on their mental health right away. But we got people in there for years and years.
Yeah, and it's considered very unethical by the UN, who I believe deemed it a form of torture, something like the Human Rights Council. So yeah, the one way I have seen programming work for solitary confinement type status is in Massachusetts. They have in the prison called Cedar Junction in the town of Walpole, MCI Cedar Junction, they have a unit called the DDU, the Departmental Disciplinary Unit. And the DDU is weird. It's like a dungeon. It's half underground, and inmates who are sent there are able to receive some forms of programming where they come into a program room and I didn't see the programs occurring, but they have these desks where you can handcuff somebody to a desk, and they have if memory serves correctly, they have like cage type situations on the walls where people are able to be in the same room. It doesn't necessarily have the most humanitarian feel. I understand that some of these folks might be dangerous, but it at least gets them in the same room, which I will say it's at least a start. But it's an imperfect solution to a complicated problem.
Right. No, it really is. I mean, especially with how small the amount of time that they have there, it's just so minimal. And, we're social beings. We need to be able to socialize and work on those social skills, whenever we can. But for individuals who, I just happened to be talking about this in one of my classes, this idea of rehabilitation assumes that the person was habilitated before they went in. And that's a real stretch when we're talking about inmates, and then we're isolating them and putting them in cells for 23, 24 hours a day, whatever it might be, and expecting them to come out of their a better functioning member of their society, whether it's inside the institution or out. And we're not getting there with what we're doing right now.
Indeed. That's a very good point. Now, switching tracks a little bit, the solitary confinement, we hit several of the names. It often goes by a name that disguises what it actually is. So like the special housing unit, that actually sounds nice, the special housing unit, when it is not a nice place to be. We also call it the security housing unit, the SHU for short for either of these. We call it administrative segregation, or SEG for short. We call it restricted housing, the box, the hole, or the dungeon.
The dungeon obviously being the one that, semantically speaking, is supposed to be the most ominous.
It's pretty ominous.
You're going to the dungeon, and we've got a dragon in there for you.
It's the scariest of all. If I'm new to prison and I don't know what's happening, and they say you're going to the dungeon, I'm
right.
It's going to evoke a fear, unlike anything else.
Yeah.
Now, a typical cell in solitary is going to be 8 by 10 feet. There's either no window or a small frosted glass window, very little to no human interaction. If I want to get any kind of programming or even permissions for a phone call, that's all dependent on the facility. And there's no real opportunities for mental stimulation or activity. And again, I'm going to spend 22 to 24 hours inside that cell. Now, Eric, tell me, why are people sent to solitary confinement? What are the typical reasons?
So first off, we can go with disciplinary issues while they're incarcerated. So that means they could have been attacked someone, whether it's staff or another inmate, or they could just be defiant and not listening to a staff member's orders. So it could be anything from walking in what's quote unquote an out of bounds area So that could include the grass at most institutions, because you're supposed to stay on a sidewalk all the time, to ignoring orders, not tucking in your shirt, whatever it might be, not wearing your shirt properly, all the way up to assault or murder even, because if you murder while in prison, you're going to be doing most of your time in one of these solitary confinement units.
Yes, for sure. Ideally, I would like to be someone who completely opposes solitary and says abolish solitary. From a pragmatic standpoint, I recognize that it can't always work that way. So my first week as a corrections officer, we're in orientation, and there was an inmate at a local prison in Monroe, Washington, who at that time strangled and killed a prison officer there named Jamie Bendel. He strangled and killed her with an amplifier cord in the chapel of the prison. And the inmate, his name Byron Scherf, he came to us for pretrial for this new crime he had committed. And he was with us for probably 2 years, most of the time that I was there as a corrections officer. And he was not allowed outside of his cell unless he had at least 2 corrections officers and a sergeant with a taser on him at all times, because he's dangerous. And if he's killed a corrections officer, there's the danger of, we can't let him around us, because what if he kills another corrections officer? So I always pose this question in my class, like, what do you do with an inmate like this? He had been extremely dangerous in the past. He'd, I believe, raped a woman, rolled her up in a carpet and set her on fire. I think he had done time on murder. He's a notably dangerous individual. So my question to you, Bronson, and even to producer Britt, what do you do with an inmate like that who's proven themselves dangerous to inmates, dangerous to corrections officers?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, if we could answer that, we'd be rich, because then we could find a way to, the prison inside the prison. It's just, even in a society of saints, you're going to have deviants, right? Well, same thing in a society of deviants, you're going to have super deviants, who are going to cause trouble and will be destroying, housing units, whatever it might be. That you're always going to have your troubled few, and how are we going to discipline them? It's tough, but I do know the answer is not locking them up for 13 years or 20 years inside solitary confinement, and then thinking, okay, they've served out their sentence, we have to let them go, and that they're ready to be back on the street. So
for sure, like we know what the answer isn't, but we don't necessarily know what the answer is. What about you, Britt?
I mean, we know, since Reagan closed down the mental institutions, that the prison population is generally just like skyrocketed since that point. And I feel like a lot of these people who we feel like are violent beyond redemption, violent beyond controlling, are just dealing with a lot of mental issues. So I think like choosing the right type of incarceration for them is key, and maybe putting them in a room with nothing isn't exactly the best option for someone with pre-existing mental conditions.
Agreed. The question is like, what do we do instead, though? It's
institutionalize them, like.
That's definitely what happens, right?
Yeah, it's difficult, and it leaves me stuck on, like, I don't know what the realistic solution is given the resources that we currently have available for gentlemen like, gentleman's a loose word, but for a gentleman like Byron Scherf. So I put that out there. I can also say people are sent to solitary confinement as protection for themselves or others. So inmates who want protective custody, when they come into the prison, they ask for protective custody. It is also referred to as PC. You're going to PC up. That means you're going to protective custody. inmates who are there on charges that might get them victimized by other inmates, such as like rape or a crime against children, something like that that might be seen as unsavory by other inmates. They might be the most likely to do that, or somebody coming in as like a police officer who's been arrested. So they don't end up getting their asses handed to them by the inmate population. People are also put in solitary confinement for gang affiliation. Eric, you want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, so if we look at a lot of these supermax institutions throughout the country, many of these individuals that are held at them might not have themselves individually carried out acts while incarcerated, but they do have the power to order other people at the institution, whether it's inside a general population, or they have the ability, the power within a gang to ask people on the outside to commit crimes against individuals. And the belief is that if we can isolate them in an institution, they won't be able to give orders, and other people won't follow them based on lack of communication. So there's a lot of belief that we look at a lot of gang members and their leadership inside these institutions. If we can isolate the leaders of these larger gangs, that'll drive down gang violence inside of institutions. So one of the best examples of this is the ADX out in Colorado. We know that a lot of the gang leaders at the federal level are being housed there. We also know that the terrorists that had anything to do with 9/11, that we've been able to get them over there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So gang affiliation is a big reason. There are some real ethical problems with this, and that you're part of a gang, that doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything yourself. So gang affiliation is something that is not necessarily even proven for people who are being put into solitary confinement, and that's problematic in what it is as well. Now, if we look around the world, the United States is it's referred to as like the only advanced nation that uses prolonged isolation as a routine tool of prison management. And solitary confinement was actually banned for juveniles in the federal prison system in 2016. Thanks, Obama. But it currently affects about 80,000 state and federal solitary confinement inmates. 80,000 people locked up in solitary confinement.
It's a lot of people not getting what they need while being incarcerated. And I just, you're in that situation. Your mental health is going downhill. Your anger and your rage is being built up, and how to handle that is not being worked on.
Yeah, that is a real problem. If we look to other countries, though, like England has so few inmates in solitary confinement that the total number of inmates in solitary confinement in the entire country of England is less than the amount of solitary confinement inmates that we have in Maine. And notably, Maine has the lowest prison population of any state. The United Nations, as mentioned earlier, they term solitary confinement as torture when it's used for longer than 15 days. So short bursts of solitary confinement may be seen as necessary when somebody cools their jets. They take it from 100 back down to baseline. And maybe in that period, you can hopefully get them the medication necessary or the treatment necessary, get them on the right path so that solitary confinement doesn't need to be an option. But if we look to other places like Belgium, uses it for a maximum of 8 days. Finland, 14 days is the maximum period you can be in solitary. England, Poland, and Wales, 28 days. France and Estonia, 45 days. And Ireland, 60 days maximum.
It's funny, you're talking about those days and the lengths that they're using them. Whenever I've been into institutions in Ireland or England and Spain, and I bring up solitary confinement, they overwhelmingly, they said they rarely use it over 6 days, that it normally is like a 3-day sentence, and then they put the person back in general population. That it's only the extreme ones where they go past anything over 6 days in those places, that you really had to have done something horrible and been consistently doing it, because they know that they need to get you back out around general population and near the programs that are available.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, what country was that? You said that was Ireland?
So Ireland, I've been to a prison in Ireland, 2 in England, and 1 in Spain. And when I talked to the administration there, boy, they downplay the use of solitary confinement and think it's, they're going to follow, the European Union countries and England, they're going to follow suggestions from the United Nations a lot closer than we are. We're going to do our own thing because we know best. We know what keeps them, people from committing crime. Clearly, we don't have much crime in this country, so we know what we're doing.
The U.S. is idiosyncratic in many ways, but it is like there's this air of American exceptionalism when it comes to how we handle prisons, when it comes to many things, but very notably so when it comes to how we handle prisons, where there's not enough being done where we look to other prisons outside of the U.S. and see how people might do it better in terms of like a humanitarian method, but also looking at the recidivism levels of other countries and looking at the outcomes. How do inmates come out of prison? How often do they end up back in prison? We're not looking to follow other people's example enough. And you do see it on a limited basis with some areas. Like I believe Connecticut has implemented some measures following German prisons, and as has New Mexico. The secretary or commissioner for the New Mexico DOC went over there and was examining some of the prisons and implemented some of the measures that they use in their prisons. And Sheriff Tompkins in Massachusetts and the Boston area for Suffolk County has also taken some of these lessons and implemented them. But there's not enough being done on like a grander scale, like the federal prisons are. This is not something that extends to all states where they're saying, let's look to other methods to see how other people might be doing this. How can we do it better? And we need
again, talking about that exceptionalism. We know how to do the criminal justice system, and nobody else does. Obviously the politicians, being hard on crime, tougher on crime, whatever. That's the way to do things. Not be soft and give inmates, apartment-like cells like they do in Scandinavia. That's the wrong way to do things.
Yes, it's seen as soft on crime, and people know that nobody ever lost an election by being tough on crime. That's part of the problem. Is how prisons have become tied to politics in our country, and all through tough on crime messaging. And you look at, especially looking at like the Bush versus Dukakis election of, what was that, 1988. So at that time, we actually had furloughs in the form of these weekend passes given to inmates in Massachusetts. An inmate got out on a weekend pass. There was a murder involved. He became demonized in the eyes of the press and ended up killing the furlough system. The whole idea of weekend passes in Massachusetts was seen as being soft on crime. So that goes away. One inmate ends up tanking an entire system by way of example, and it becomes a politically unpopular measure. That's tough. And it makes prisons potentially worse, and other people have to suffer for it when it's a nice like release valve. It's a nice reward system when we don't often think of reward systems in prisons, because we end up thinking of how can we punish people more, not how can we reward them for their behavior, when we should be thinking like people's behavior in prisons. We'll talk about this in some future episode, talking about parole and the ins and outs of that, but people should be rewarded for their time inside. Behavior and how people act and how people think is not necessarily a static process. So maybe we reward them for doing well, and then they're set up better to succeed on the outside, doing well and acting more pro-socially.
Oh, your ass is never going to get elected. Listen to how soft you are wanting to give inmates rewards. What the hell's wrong with
Please,
you?
this is my platform here. Be kind.
Yeah.
Now, Bronson, I know you're short on time. You've
boy.
got 11 minutes or so. So at this point, I want to take a pause. I have more talk about like the psychological effects, the pros and cons of solitary, inmate experiences, and a couple studies on solitary confinement. Do we want to bank that for a part 2, or do we want to continue with that for another couple minutes and then go to movie minute? How would you like to go?
I think let's bank it because there's more than enough there for one episode, even one that goes over an hour, I think.
Yeah, so I'll end this section with like talking about some of the in general, speaking of like the pros and cons of solitary to kind of wrap together what I was talking about, and then we can elaborate more on the other stuff next time. That sound good?
Yep, sounds good.
So while there's many more things to talk about, including many studies and a lot of the psychological effects of solitary confinement, I just want to end this segment with talking about, in brief, some of the pros and cons of solitary. So some of the advantages that we can get from solitary confinement, it can offer some short-term separation of inmates that are at harm from others, or inmates that we think will harm other people. So if somebody's hot-headed, take them to the side, they're on an adult timeout. Another pro is if there is any kind of dangerous gang activity, the staff catches wind of, hey, there's this gang is going to be going at it with another gang. It can be used to potentially separate gang members. It can also give corrections officers more authority in hopes of derailing some dangerous situations. And it can act potentially as a deterrent for certain situations because people might not want to break rules if that means being sent to solitary. It's not necessarily good in all situations because people are probably sent to solitary for a lot more reasons. It's too much of a catch-all as a punishment. And so we see people being sent to solitary for way more reasons than are needed, but it's still an option. The cons, the disadvantages of solitary. It's got a lot of physiological effects, some psychological effects. We'll discuss those more next time. Studies show generally that it's not effective when it comes to limiting violence. I can think of 3 different studies off the top, which it's so mixed in its evidence that if we look at, okay, does sending someone to solitary make them less violent when they come out of solitary? In the 3 different studies, one study says, yes, it does. One study says, no, it doesn't. And the third study says, the evidence is kind of mixed. So we don't have a clear answer to that. It's also,
yeah. Well, I was going to say it's. I think we know that we could do a study where we just count the number of violent acts after somebody has been locked up in solitary confinement and compare it with those who haven't, and just see if there's the amount of time on. The amount of time spent in solitary confinement is there's a positive relationship between that and the number of violent acts that an inmate commits, unless we just leave them in there because as one goes up, the other one goes up.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't see any clear reduction in prison violence. It potentially increases recidivism on the outside because it's not making anyone better. It's not addressing any kind of criminogenic roots, any reasons why people offend. It's so expensive, and we know that it's this inhumane treatment of people. So why do we still use it to the level that we do? And we're going to examine some of that more next time, and we'll be examining some of the studies, some of the literature, to see what does come of solitary, what are the psychological effects of solitary confinement, and we'll be looking into some inmate experiences. Now, that's the end of part 1 on solitary. Shall we move on to our favorite segment?
Movie minute.
Movie minute.
Movie minute. Movie minute. 60 seconds with producer Britt to talk about movies.
Movie minute.
Movie minute. Let's put 60 seconds on the clock. So last week, Judge Bronson here sentenced me to watch 1990's Ernest Goes to Jail. So, Ernest Goes to Jail is a 1990 family comedy directed by John Cherry, the co-creator of the Ernest character, along with Ernest himself, Jim Varney. And if you're not familiar with the character, go Google Jim Varney Ernest right now and familiarize yourself. The film follows kindly but clumsy Ernest P. Worrell, who gets electrocuted at work at a bank, resulting in his magnetization. Problems compound when a mix-up causes Ernest to switch places with his evil convict doppelganger, and he's placed on death row. Ernest makes some unsuccessful but fun prison break attempts before finally being condemned to death. Giving up, Ernest makes an impassioned speech for his innocence before being placed in the electric chair and summarily executed. But this doesn't kill him. It just remagnetizes him. He uses his to break out of prison. Ernest's evil doppelganger takes his girlfriend and a security guard hostage. A fight ensues between the two, and the movie resolves exactly like you think it would, with Ernest accidentally saving the day. Spoiler alert. This movie rocks. It's dumb, it's silly, it has nothing substantive to say about anything real, and it's for children and adults with mental disabilities, which is why I love it. Probably says more about me than it does about a 35-year-old family film. R.I.P. Jim Varney. Long live the king. 3.5 soups.
No, really?
I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
3.5. Wow. Wow.
I told you
That's
last
amazing.
week, I love this film. It's stupid. It's like the best Ernest film, though, besides maybe Ernest Scared Stupid.
Now, Bronson, something we didn't tell you is... Oh, am I still muted? No, I'm not. Bronson, something we didn't tell you is that producer Britt actually has seen not only all of the Ernest films, he's also seen all of the Ernest commercials and all of the... What was the Ernest show called?
Hey Vern.
So we have a super fan of Ernest.
I also watched... the prequel to the Ernest films, Doctor something in the Riddle of the Gloom Beam, which is like a spin-off of the show Hey Vern, and it also is the first appearance of Ernest.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple questions about the film. First off, do you believe Ernest deserved to go to jail?
No. His doppelganger is the one who committed the crimes, and no, he didn't deserve to go to jail. Definitely not.
What was the initial crime?
I don't think it said what his doppelganger's crime was. He was already in jail, condemned to death. I assume murder if he's condemned to death. I mean, do they condemn you to death for anything else? I think so.
No, constitutionally they can't do that. When they got rid of the death penalty in the 70s and brought it back, it was under the provision that this is only for capital murder. So yes. Let's see. My other question is, do you think that you would be remagnetized if electrocuted in an electric chair?
There's only one way to find out. I got to commit some capital murder.
Well, you got to go to a state that's still using that electric chair.
Yeah.
So,
doesn't Texas? Yeah. Well, Texas also...
No, Texas, they're using lethal injection.
Oh, shoot. Well, I wanted to go there because, they still kill people with mental disabilities. So, that includes me.
Yeah, they do. They definitely do.
Now, can a person get magnetized? Is that even possible?
No.
Well, not through electrifying them.
No. You can't make a person into an electromagnet through a funny happenstance. I don't think. I think that death.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. My final question. The doppelganger. He actually seems kind of cool. He's like a cool version of Ernest. I mean, besides the potential murder and kidnapping.
Ernest
is all suave.
Yeah. He's like the bad boy version of Ernest, which we all love. We all love a bad boy,
Yeah. I think he's like a sexy
Yeah,
Ernest.
exactly.
Oh.
Yeah, he's like the cool one. He's like the rapper in a K-pop band.
That's great.
All right, that's been another movie minute. For next episode, we're all sentencing ourselves.
Yes.
To watch a couple of prison films. Eric, will you tell me those films?
So first, we are going to watch Cool Hand Luke, and then we're going to follow that up with another prison movie about life on a prison farm, and it will be the movie Life with Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence. A couple of classics on prison life in the South. With both of them with all kinds of great quotes that are used in popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to see these. I've watched them in my youth. I've not watched them since working at a prison or studying prisons. So I'm interested to see what new insights we can pull out of this. And so we'll be not just providing a breakdown. We want to provide a more insightful breakdown on some of the prison themes and some of the, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the
Didactics.
themes. Some of the themes and didactics. No, I don't like that. That sounds too unnatural. Themes and themes and accuracies and inaccuracies that we might note from films like this.
Yeah.
Eric has been to a number of prisons in the South, and he is our resident expert on what something like this might look like. So we're going to rely on him a lot for this.
And I've been lucky enough to actually go to some prison farms, one of which we will be taking our students to this fall when we go to the wildest show in the South at the Louisiana State Penitentiary Prison Rodeo.
Indeed. And I'll be looking forward to that. All right. Shall we put a bow on it?
Let's put a bow on it. Flip that switch.
Flip that switch. All right, everyone. Thank you again for listening to our beloved Prison Breakdown. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, rate, and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or I suppose it's Apple Music now, or Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. I don't care what it is, whatever you like. Eric, I think it's time for Lights Out, buddy.
Lights out.